You're listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies.
Welcome to Petticoats and Poppies, History Girls at the Movies. We're your hosts, Maggie and
Nicole.
Welcome back to a new year. I can't believe it's 2023, and I am so excited to be back talking about historical dramas with Nicole.
Our favorite hobby.
I know, our favorite hobby. And I am so excited that our other favorite hobby, which is talking about some of our favorite weird things that we've been obsessed with for our whole lives, always finds a way of intersecting with this episode. And this is an episode that I am always been so excited to talk about, in a movie I've been so excited to talk about, which is The Pale Blue Eye, a mystery thriller film on Netflix, currently streaming. It was written and directed by Scott Cooper and adapted from the 2003 novel by the same name by Louis Bayard, and it stars Christian Bale, Harry Melling, Gillian Anderson, Lucy Boynton, Charlotte Gainsbourg, Toby Jones, Harry Lottie, Simon McBurney, Timothy Spall, and Robert Duvall. It was released in select theaters back in December, on December 23rd, and now it is streaming on Netflix, so everyone should go watch it. And overall, it got fairly positive reviews. A few, I believe, said it was a little bit slow, which, isn't always a bad thing, especially when you're working with a mystery thriller. And basically, the film is about a veteran detective by the name of Augustus Landor, who investigates a series of murders at the United States Military Academy in 1830 in West Point, New York. And a young Edgar Allan Poe, who's a military cadet, is enlisted to aid him in solving the mystery. So I feel like based off that, kind of can guess I really enjoyed this. Nicole, did you enjoy this movie?
Yeah, based on that, it's like, oh, it's a film for Maggie and Nicole. I immediately, in the first 5 minutes, I was like, this gothic, spooky tone. I'm loving it. That's my thing. I do agree with, some of the criticisms. Like, I do think that it's a bit slow moving. I think there's a little bit in the middle where it starts to lose steam, but it gets it back,
Yeah.
And there is one moment of really shoddy special effects with the fire. But those are my only two real big criticisms of it. I think, it's not a great film that's gonna reinvent the genre, but it's a solid entry in this sort of genre. And what makes it entirely worth its while, even if I didn't like anything else in it, would be Harry Melling as Edgar Allan Poe.
Right?
Pre-mustache Poe.
He is a perfect casting.
Oh my God. It's literally some of the best casting. Okay, his theatrical oddball interpretation of Poe with the accent and everything. I was literally this man gets it. And genuinely, who would have guessed he would be one of the most talented actors to come out of, the Harry Potter kids? No one saw this coming.
I am so embarrassed to admit that it took me halfway through this movie for me to finally realize where I knew him from, because I couldn't believe it. I was like, no, this is not Dudley.
You knew him from that, but also from I feel every Netflix movie of the past few years.
He has been a Netflix boy, and honestly, I
love it for
the
working for him, and they clearly know how to use him. Mm-hmm. And
this was inspired casting.
Yeah, and I think, though, I say that, it's worth it just for him, but also I think the cinematography is great. I love the costumes, especially everything that they put on Lucy Boynton, who is an actress that I adore. I think that the hair and makeup work was really good. Yep. And I really enjoyed Lucy Boynton in this. I feel like she typically gets relegated to, in the past, she's been relegated to more meeker roles, I feel like.
Yes.
And seeing her do this, and then I saw her portrayal of Marie Antoinette in Chevalier, which comes out later this year. And it's her year. She is amazing, and she's an actress I've been following since she was a little kid in ballet shoes. And this is some of her best work. I love getting to see her go a little unhinged. There's a specific scene of this movie, and I won't spoil it because we can talk about the history of it without talking about the ending of the film.
The twist.
Where she's a little unhinged. And I was literally Harry Melling, get out of there. Let me be the one. Which, if you know what I'm talking about, everyone's now concerned for me. But genuinely, I was I love this. I think I think this is one of those movies that I'm going to be yelling for the rest of like 2023 about people sleeping on it.
They truly, I am so afraid people are going to sleep on this one.
Like, I've already got my movie to yell about.
I have so many of them. And 2 of them
my God,
are on Netflix.
Yeah. Hey, listen, I love a good Netflix period drama.
Me too.
They hit.
They really do. Oh my gosh. I love this movie so much. I was so excited about it because I'm like an obnoxious Poe girly. Like,
well, you're a Poe girly and you're a Christian Bale girly.
Yeah, I was like, to have Christian Bale, and this is like just peak me. Like, this was made for 2011 me. Also, like, this is the funniest part of this entire thing about this movie. So I was handling this. It has to be a story. I have to tell this as a story. So I was handling an exclusive for Collider for my day job. And I was like, oh, like, I don't know if I know a lot about Scott Cooper. Like, I've seen his movies, but I've never really like looked into what his career has been. So like, I looked on Wikipedia, and I saw that he was from this like really small town in Virginia, which happens to be where all of my Coopers are from. And like, when I say it's a small town, I mean like, our family's all buried in the same cemetery. It's a small cemetery on the side of a hill. And, you know, because I'm me and I love ancestry, I like started digging into this because I needed to know. And yeah, I found out that Scott Cooper is a blood relative of mine, like, and not even far away. Like, we share a great grandparent. And because of like our family's location, we got a couple other blood relations as well. So yeah, I discovered that I am related to the director of this movie, and not like distantly, like could potentially run into him at a family reunion if I went to our family reunions.
That is so insane to me. And like, it's also, there's something so funny about the fact that like he would make a movie that's so you.
And he's worked with Christian Bale so many times. Yeah. And like when because I was reading stuff about like why Christian Bale doesn't really like collaborating with the same directors multiple times. He likes like a few and then moving on. And he like really likes Scott Cooper's style, and the stuff that he talked about that he likes about his style and the things that he gets is so funny to me, because the areas where like Christian Bale is from in England and then like Wales, like is not directly tied to the community in Virginia. So I feel like there's like something in like the blood that connects like certain demographics and certain locations to like a certain type of filmmaking. And I think that's why I ended up really liking this, because it touched so deeply into a certain melancholy that is very indicative of like Virginia. And knowing that Poe spent so much time in Richmond, most of his life, which is, as the bird flies, not too far away from, because like my great grandfather went to a tuberculosis hospital in Richmond from that area, like traveled there. So like not that far away. And I think there's a very certain type of aesthetic that lends itself to like how Poe wrote his works. And I just think it all works. It's like a magical, like perfect combination of things. I know I sound like a crazy person, and our listeners are going to listen to this and be like, she's crazy. But yeah, no, that I found that out. And I just think it's absolutely freaking hilarious. Also, a bunch of my friends worked on this movie because it was filmed in Pittsburgh. And I like later found out like a ton of the crew and like stunt people were people that I know. Yeah, weirdly connected to this movie. Also love the fact that the Fettermans were in this. That was hilarious to me. It also makes sense because like they've filmed in Pennsylvania numerous times. Right. Everything about this movie was just like check.
Literally.
I was happy.
Checking every box.
Every box.
Well, so obviously with this movie, like it's really nice when there's a movie that we just want to talk about because we like it and we want to like, you know, maybe bring it to some more people's attention or whatever, that actually has like historical topics very closely tied to it that are very easy for us to talk about. Like, I love when we're not grasping for straws. And this one obviously does. So I wanted to start by just giving like a general background on Edgar Allan Poe. And as I do sometimes, I think I may have gone too far into it. Like, I just realized that I have like multiple pages of notes, but that's fine. we're going to do this. Edgar Allan Poe was actually born in Boston on January 19th of 1809. Somebody quickly figure out what zodiac sign that makes him. What's that? Is that a Capricorn or is that into Taurus? I don't know. He was the son of actually an English actress, Elizabeth Arnold Poe, and an American actor, David Poe Jr., which this was news to me. Like, I felt like I knew, I know a bit about Poe, but I didn't know he was the son of two actors.
Nepo baby.
Yeah, oh my God. If only, though. His father left the family, though, in 1810. So there goes being a Nepo baby. And his mom died in 1811. So by the time he's 3, he's taken in by John Allan, who people think may have been his godfather, and his wife Frances. And they didn't have any kids of their own, but John Allan was like a fairly well-to-do Richmond, Virginia merchant. And they sent him to boarding schools. He spends time in Scotland and England from like 1815 to 1820. He receives this really good education. He's super smart. He's already like interested in writing. And he goes to the University of Virginia. And I feel like this is also so interesting for you and me specifically, Maggie, just because a lot of what we talk about is history like in Europe or stuff. And this is a lot closer to us. I've been on campus. I know you've been there.
Yes, I've been to every single Poe residence except for West Point. I've even been to the place that he stayed in the Bronx and Charleston.
Yeah, but I also know like University of Virginia is not that far from you. So, I mean, close. Relatively.
I mean, so close.
Yeah. But so he was there for about a year. I think it was like 11 months. And he actually got really, high grades, but he ends up dropping out because he has so much gambling debt that he needs to leave school. And he returns home to Richmond and finds that his sweetheart, Sarah, but she went by her middle name, Elmira Royster, is engaged to another man. So talk about getting hit by a lot of things at once. And he moves to Boston and he publishes his first set of poems, which is called Tamerlane and Other Poems in 1827. But he's in debt. He's, doesn't have any money. So what does he do? He joins the army, as people do. And he spends, a few miserable months after leaving the army at West Point. But we'll get back to that later. In the meantime, post West Point, or in the middle of all that, he does release his second book of poetry, Al-Araf, Tamerlane and Minor Poems in 1829. But post West Point, he moves to New York City and he publishes his third volume of poetry, and he moves to Baltimore. He basically bounces around like the Upper East Coast for his entire life. And when he's in Baltimore, he starts to write short stories. And in 1835, he becomes the editor of Southern Literary Messenger, and he really makes a name for himself as a reviewer and an editor of magazines. It's also in this time period, he's living with his aunt and his cousin, and he marries his 13-year-old cousin, Virginia Clem. And seemingly by all accounts, he's a really good husband, a really good son-in-law. The circumstances of their marriage are still a little murky. It's sort of unclear if there was a reason that he needed to marry her to sort of put his protection over her. It's not entirely clear. It also seems based on, there are sources from the time that imply that they were living as brother and sister, at least until she's older in her later teens. Certainly, it's not as sketchy as it sounds. And there are reasons, I also think like people, whenever they hear that, I think it's very natural to balk at the like 13 years old part of it, but like a reminder that a lot of people married their first cousins in that time period. Yeah. That was not seen as unusual at all.
And if like she was compromised at all, or if there was like other people trying to vie for her that were like being creepy, like there's so many things that we will never know about the situation.
That's why like I don't cast judgment on him for this, because especially for the time, and even for writers of the time, he certainly seems to have better views towards women than a lot of men. And I think that if it was a random 13-year-old girl, I'd be more like, that's sketchy. But the fact that it's his cousin actually is what makes me think that it's not sketchy.
And he called her mother.
Yes. So I think, and that's the thing, he's so close with his aunt, her mother, that like it definitely seems like there's something going on there that somehow just didn't get passed down to us. Maybe we'll find it someday. Who knows? But he does have a continuing ongoing drinking problem. It ends up maybe costing him his job in Richmond. He returns to New York City. And there were some people, like people have claimed that like, oh, he had a drug problem, but that seems very unlikely. There was a doctor who thought that he had a brain lesion, which we'll return to that in a bit. Certainly, if nothing else, he definitely was dealing with what seems to have been like true alcoholism. It's not like he was some sort of like party boy, debauch, drunk.
Also, like, given how horrible his life is from like start to finish, I get it.
Right, like, fair enough, dude. But so in 1838, he publishes the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, which is actually one of the inspirations for Moby Dick, which is interesting. He was a very influential writer in the time. I'll get to that again in a minute. But in the following year, in 1839, he becomes the co-editor of the Philadelphia Burton's Gentleman's Magazine, and he starts writing these like supernatural horror stories in monthly chapters. A reminder that a lot of things at this time were serialized, and magazines were really in their heyday at this time, and hence that's sort of how he's able, I think, to popularize the form of the short story. And the magazine eventually, like, it sort of, from my understanding, becomes Graham's Ladies and Gentlemen's Magazine. And he publishes the first detective story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, in 1841 in that magazine, which is pretty cool. He returns to New York. He becomes the sub-editor of the New York Mirror. One of his friends is the editor of it. And that is where he publishes The Raven, which is, I think, still his most famous poem, and was at the time as well, in 1845. It rockets him to national fame. He republishes a bunch of his like short stories that he'd already published because now people care. And he, at this time too, is like pursued by this poet who was popular at the time but has kind of been forgotten, Francis Sargent Locke Osgood. And it seems like it didn't cause any issues for his marriage, but it kind of got out and caused this like scandal in the circles that they were in. But he publishes The Raven and Other Poems as a book in 1845. And then the following year, he like leaves the bustling city for a cottage in Fordham, which is now part of the city, but it wasn't then. And he writes for Godey's Lady's Book, a series of what I saw described as gossipy sketches, which actually do end up causing him a libel suit, but were very popular. He was writing sort of about like the well-known people, the celebrities of the day. You can imagine, if you know Poe's writing at all, what those would have looked like. He's very witty. But then, so like things seem to be like starting to go a little bit better for him. So of course something bad happens because we're talking about Edgar Allan Poe. And in 1847, Virginia dies from tuberculosis at a, very young age. And it makes his depression and his alcoholism get worse for a while. He is genuinely devastated by her death. And the following year, though, he goes to Rhode Island. He to court this poet, Sarah Helen Whitman. He writes poetry about her and also his friends, Annie Richmond and Sarah Anna Lewis, who he had very close platonic relationships with. But in 1849, he returns to Richmond. And if you remember, his first love, Elmira Royster, who married another man, she's widowed. Great news. And well, for him, not for the husband. And so they reconnect, they get engaged. Once again, things are maybe on the up and up for him. So something bad must occur. And it's said that he has forebodings about his impending death in the days before it happens. Maybe that's actually just what I articulated. And he's things are going well for me. Something bad's going to happen. Or maybe he does actually have some sort of, premonition. But the circumstances surrounding his death are still, once again, very murky. People still really debate the cause of his death. What is known is that he was headed up north and he's in Baltimore and he's found in the street, stumbling around, confused and incoherent. And he is able to give the person who finds him, the name of a friend, and they bring him there. And he spends 4 days in this sort of dazed state before finally dying. And so, of course, there's a lot of different things that people think might have caused it. Some people think he drank himself to death. At the time, he was sober. And, I think this is one of those things that people very early on assumed, like, oh, he somehow got off the wagon. Like, he met up with some people who convinced him to drink, and maybe that's what occurred. It doesn't seem like the likeliest cause, but it is one of the sort of things that gets thrown out early on. Some people think it's just heart failure of some sort. His death certificate lists it as a swelling of the brain, which again relates back to that before he'd been told he had like a brain lesion. So like that is definitely a possible cause. I read this fascinating thing that some people think he was cooped or a victim of cooping, which was this voter fraud like method basically where a group of men would, take somebody and like force them to vote a certain way, get them maybe drunk, maybe, whatever that would have left him in this sort of state. And he was found near, like on election day and like by a polling place. So that's part of why people think that like that may have been what occurred to him. There also for a while was this theory about like carbon monoxide poisoning. There was this theory about like mercury poisoning, but they actually like they did do a test on his hair and the results basically concluded that like that's probably not what it was. But I was fascinated that that was a thing that like scholars were like, maybe it was carbon monoxide. Some people think it was rabies, which is a fascinating thing. Suddenly I'm afraid of rabies, but rabies was a lot more common at the time than it is now. So, I definitely think that that's a possible cause. It sort of does match with how they found him. Another one is that people thought that he had a brain tumor. There's this whole story about how when they like move his coffin from where he's buried to like somewhere different, that there's like something most of it's like disintegrated, but there's this like hard piece that they're like, it's his brain. And then people are like, no, brains are actually like the first thing to go. But then somebody's like, well, it could be a brain tumor. And because that actually might like remain while the rest of your body rots, I guess. So that's an interesting theory and one that I'm like, okay, well, I see how we got here. And then there are people who think that like, oh, it's some form of suicide or whatever. But unless we're talking about like suicide via drinking oneself to death, that feels weird to me considering it took him 4 days and it doesn't like none of his symptoms really match with like popular poisons of the time as far as I could find. So that's the kind of theory that I would throw out, but certainly something weird happened to him and the doctors who were attending to him like couldn't figure it out. But he does die in Baltimore and he's buried there. And obviously, like everybody knows the name of Edgar Allan Poe now. He is basically the central figure of American Romanticism. He is one of the first people to popularize the short story. He is considered the inventor of detective fiction. And he's also considered as someone who like really developed sort of science fiction. He also was one of the main Americans who was talking about like art for art's sake, even more so than in Europe at the time. There was really this idea that art needed like a moral purpose and a lesson and everything. And he was one of the first people to like really push back against that. Which is fascinating, especially because I think, typically whenever you talk about art for art's sake, it's now linked to Oscar Wilde. But Poe was also an early, proponent of that sort of school of thinking. And he also notably, according to a thing that I found, which I was like, there's no way that I can verify this, is the first American writer to solely live off of his earnings from writing, which is why he was so poor for so much of his life. And I don't know like what the stats are on like when the first person did that in Europe versus America, but he is someone who was able to sort of make a full career out of it without coming from any wealth, because as I'll talk about later, he, was raised by this wealthy sort of foster parent who never formally adopted him, but they have a falling out when Poe was a young man. And so he really is like making it on his own in the world. And then with, sort of supporting, but also with the help of his mother-in-law. It really is tragic when you look at his life, his like fairly short life, and truly a series of unfortunate events. But it's amazing that he is able to be as productive as he was and like write the amount that he did with everything that was going on for him.
Honestly, he is truly just a sad, sad boy his entire life. I have to say, this makes me sound like such a ghoul. In Baltimore, so I have been to his grave, but also in Baltimore, you can go to the tavern where it is said that he had his last drink the day that he was then found confused and dazed and confused, which has now been named Poe's Last Stand. It's a very good tavern and has really great food. It's also really great like atmosphere. But yeah, you can visit it. It's really cool. I went there, 2019 or something. But like when I say that I've been to like everywhere that Poe has been,
you really
sometimes unintentionally. There's like 2 places that I just like ended up at, and then there was like a marker or part of the tour was like, oh yeah, and then Poe came here, and I'm like,
oh my god.
Okay.
You're like, hello.
But honestly, I admire the way that he was so productive when his life was falling apart. And he really does seem to evoke the idea that like the most depressed people make the best art.
It also like it's so funny that he, really furthered this like Gothic movement, especially in America, because if you like read his life, it reads like some sort of like Gothic story.
Horror.
Like, just the fact that he's like orphaned at a young age, like taken in by this wealthy man. Like,
that he has a falling out with, and then he tries to go to the military and it doesn't go well, and then he comes back and his beloved is already engaged to another man. So and then he steps up and he marries his cousin, and they live with like their invalid grandmother, and like there's all of this stuff in his home life, and then then she dies
of tuberculosis, no less.
Like the same thing his mother died from.
It's also like you can't have a good Gothic story without somebody getting consumption.
His mother and his wife get it, and then you have him falling into depression, and then he finally gets to reunite with his first love, and then he dies.
It truly I'm fascinated that nobody's made like a proper
Del Toro
biopic or something. Literally, like, Del Toro, where are you? Like,
Del Toro, go ahead and just hire Harry Melling. Like, just
I will also say this now before I end up forgetting to say it, but like, you know how Netflix now has the Knives Out sort of franchise, and they supposedly plan to continue making Benoit Blanc films, which I fully support because the Benoit Blanc cinematic universe is the most important one.
It's so important to me.
If we could have the like Edgar Allan Poe cinematic universe, if he wants to go like solve some other little things, like I don't care how fictionalized we have to get, as long as Harry Melling is playing him, I'm in.
This man traveled up and down the East Coast. There are so many places that he could solve murders.
Exactly.
And then be like, oh, I'm so inspired. I'm going to write a weird little poem about this. Like,
right? Like, that's what I want. Netflix, are you listening?
He writes that detective story. It makes sense that he would be inspired by his own weird little detective.
Exactly. And it also makes sense that he wouldn't like be leaving like records of this per se. Like,
exactly. There you go.
He's not like, Dear Virginia, solved a murder today.
And then like the reason around his like mysterious death and everything. If it was like election nonsense, that's like a perfect murder mystery right there. Netflix,
right?
Call us. We will write it for you.
Netflix, call us.
Call us.
In any case, I'll let you talk about your actual work instead of being out here being like, Netflix, please.
Oh gosh. Well, you know, it was so interesting the way you talked about that he was like one of the first American writers to make a living through writing alone. I could not help myself but research the conversion rate between now and 1843, which is when Poe published The Telltale Heart. And in 1843, he was paid $10, which sounds like a tragedy, but it is about $340 today, which all things considered is
pretty good.
Okay, so I have to say that like nothing has actually changed, because like if I wrote a short story about the same length as The Telltale Heart and tried to find like an online publisher for it, they'd probably pay me about $350.
And like that would be a decent rate, like a pretty good rate.
But like the fact that it hasn't changed since 1843, it's the
right,
same.
Like that's horrific. But what's funnier to me about it though is like it's something where whenever you really think about it, you're like, okay, yeah, that's actually not a bad rate. But then you think about like the work that we're talking about, and it's like he should have made a lot more money for that.
Exactly. Now we have
Yeah.
computers that are like so easy to type on, but this is a man sitting here with like his little pen
And
set.
especially too, like you think like, okay, it's one thing to think that like I could sell my own little like diddly short story for like $40, and I'd be like, yeah, that's nice. The thought of the Telltale Heart being paid that much is
Exactly. It's just
yeah,
wild to me. And I'm not
yeah,
talking about the Telltale Heart just because I love it to death. I am talking about it because
sure.
this is where the title of this movie comes from. But before we get into the actual history of it, I am going to finish up talking about where it was published. So, like I said, it was published in 1843. It was published in the inaugural issue of James Russell Lowell and Robert Carter's very short lived Boston magazine that was called The Pioneer, a literary and critical magazine. Honestly, it seemed like every Tom, Dick, and Harry was starting their own little imprints and magazines throughout this time period, which is very funny. It to me feels like people who are like, I'm going to start a blog and then gets my friends to write on this blog. It's basically the same thing. Society has not changed whatsoever, especially if you look at Poe's like history of being like his buddies. He's going to be like the sub editor for his buddies' print, and like it's just very funny to me. Like nothing has changed. We just have different words for it now, which just makes me very happy. So I would say, with the exception of The Raven, The Telltale Heart is probably Poe's most well-known piece of literature, and is also widely hailed as one of the most notable pieces of Gothic fiction like ever. It's just one that people usually recognize whether they've read it once or 100 times. Very much in the same vein of The Raven, where like everybody has that somewhere in their like middle school, high school education. They've read it. They are aware of it. And it also, not to like get really, I am going to get really, I was going to say, I'm not going to get deep into like literary nonsense in this, but I am. So just stay here for it. Just hold on. So basically, the Telltale Heart utilizes the unreliable narrator, which implores the reader to believe that they are completely sane, while also revealing a murder that the narrator has seemingly committed. They've obviously committed it. Not only does some of the themes of the pale blue eye connect to the Telltale Heart, such as hearts being cut out, but this is also obviously like where the author pulled the author of the original book pulled the title from, and then obviously they used it for the movie as well. Throughout the short story, the narrator harps on this vulture eye, this evil eye that watched them. But it was this line from the Telltale Heart that birthed the title. One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue eye with film over it. And I should note the movie also uses something that looks like the pale blue eye that's painted on the floor as well, which I thought was really good and very subtle, kind of drawing it all together. It wasn't like super overt, but like the Poe girlies could recognize all of the references and allusions to Poe's work throughout it. And I will say, with the short story, it should be noted that the narrator cannot go through with the murder when the eye is closed, because it isn't the man that vexed him, but the evil eye that has him so upset. So once the victim opens this pale blue eye, that's when he strikes. Unlike with the pale blue eye, which does ultimately reveal the murderer and the motives behind the murder, the why of this heinous crime in the Telltale Heart is never really described and is instead left up to ambiguity's sake. So, like, obviously the narrator hates this eye of the murdered old man, but there really is just no motive, and the narrator never fully reveals the connection between like the murder and the victim. The narrator even goes so far as to like claim that he had no ill will towards the victim. They never hated him, never resented him. It wasn't like he killed out of greed. It's just really fascinating the way that Poe sets this up to be so ambiguous and to like really take the reader on a journey with his narrator. And I think one of the most intriguing and perhaps the most memorable aspects of The Telltale Heart is the way that Poe's narrator describes the actual act of the murder, the very careful, precise calculations of the plan, the attempt to commit this perfect crime, to get away with it, and then like the act of dismembering the body in a bathtub to make for an easy cleanup. Like it's like you would think that Poe had committed a crime. It's just like the way that he writes this is so I don't want to say it sounds like listening to like a true crime podcast, but it kind of feels like listening to a true crime podcast. Like just the way that the details and like it's just such a creepy short story. And then obviously you have like the aftermath of the murder and this guilty conscience that plagues the narrator. That's like the real kicker of the story. And I think the thing that is like the most perhaps memorable and the most utilized illusion that you see in other works of horror and gothic storytelling. So after dismembering the victim and hiding parts of the victim under the floorboards, the narrator begins hearing a thumping sound like that of a heartbeat, or at least that's what we are meant to assume it is. And so it really parallels this idea of a guilty conscience. And you'll see this in a lot of horror movies today and a lot of thrillers. Like you'll hear the heartbeat thumping and it'll get like louder and louder and louder and louder. That comes from Poe's work. Like that is the impact that he has had on this genre of storytelling. And I think it's great. It's through all of this that Poe like slowly reveals the narrator's monomania and paranoia, which later literary critics and scholars have, more or less diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenia. Similar anachronistic readings also posit that we, as the readers, might be the narrator's lawyer or doctor or somebody they are confessing all of this to in prison, just because of the way that it's written, because it's never really clearly stated like who we are, and it's very much like being told to us, which I think is interesting, and I think it changes how you read it, and like it when you consider it through different points of view. It's interesting. I had actually never really looked into that until researching for this and seeing how many different variations of the story are interpreted. Like it's just very interesting to me. I just also like I wanted to bring up like the personal aspect of this. Like I love The Telltale Heart. It is my favorite of all of Poe's work. Like I do love The Raven. I can quote basically the entirety of The Raven. And I also love Annabelle Lee. I have a copy of Annabelle Lee somewhere in my room. But I really think that The Telltale Heart is just so fascinating. And I think it probably birthed a lot of my love for like gothic horror, gothic terror, and probably also true crime. But so I was actually first introduced to the story when I was like maybe 4 or 5, which I think may be too young. Maybe, I don't know. I saw What Lies Beneath when I was like 3. So who knows? Honestly, who knows? But my mom read this to me because it was like one that she really liked. And it became like a yearly tradition for us to read this every Halloween because it just has like a very Halloween vibe to it. And we read it like multiple times, like until I was like 12, and we stopped doing like shared reading together. But also I have like a ridiculously strict moral code, just like personally. And I also have like an overactive conscience where like if I see a cop, I'll be like, oh my God, they'll think I did it. And I'm like, what did I do? I'm just walking across the street. Like, I'm just so overly guilty about things that I have not done. They're like, what if they think I did? But like the thumping heart and the floorboards, I think might have been like permanently ingrained in me and like a really weird level. And it like is just always in the forefront of my mind. I know this probably makes me feel like a crazy person, but like I love the story, and it made me so excited when I saw. I was like, oh my God, they named it after this. And then because it was before I recognized that there was a book that this was based on, and it just made me very excited.
I love all of that so much, genuinely. Like, I also loved you getting into like the literary analysis of this. Like, you also made me, I read this, I haven't read it in so many years, and now I'm like, I need to go reread it. So
It's on the Poe Museum if you don't want to buy a copy of it.
oh, amazing.
It's
okay, perfect.
easily found online.
Yeah.
But yeah, I had to pare this back because I was like, this could be like 7 pages of me just like literally blathering on about this because there's so many little things. And like, let's do a line by line reading. And I was like, no,
Yeah.
Nicole's going to be like, nope, we're vetoing this because there's so much about Poe
Oh my God.
and his life and just like everything that we wanted to talk about in this episode.
Yeah.
So I will let you talk about West Point now.
Okay. Well, I feel like this is going to be like a little bit of a come down from that, but I wanted to obviously talk about Poe's time at West Point because we see him, at West Point in the movie. I was honestly trying to figure out, like, after doing all this research, like, at what point in his West Point career are we supposed to believe this movie takes place? Which, to be fair, we don't see him like ever going to class, so that tracks. But basically, as an 18-year-old, as I had said earlier, he had accumulated like a lot of gambling debt during his first year at the University of Virginia. So he leaves there and he goes to Boston and he publishes some poems, but he needs to earn money. And at this point, he sort of is alienated from John Allan, his guardian, as, understandably, I think, like if your adoptive son runs up a ton of gambling debt in his first year of college, that's going to cause some tension. So he, does what boys do and he joins the army. And he joins as an artilleryman for some reason under the name Edgar A. Perry, which kind of feels to me like, in Shang-Chi, when she's like, you had to choose a new name instead of Shang and you chose Sean. Like, he was like, I'll just keep the whole first part, but we'll go with Perry. Literally, my initials are still the same. In any case, he first serves in Boston at Fort Independence and then later in Fort Moultrie in South Carolina. And he becomes an artificer? Artificer? I don't know. I don't know anything about the military. But basically, that was someone at the time who was like really good at prepping shells, any kind of explosives, and he like is very good at that sort of like mechanical thing. So they put him into that. 2 years into his enlistment, which was meant to be for 5 years, he is promoted to sergeant major, which is the highest rank a non-commissioned officer could reach at the time. I don't know if that's still true. He's like, you know what? I'm done. I don't think the army's for me. Surprise, surprise. This like moody poet doesn't really vibe with the army. So he's ready to get out. He finds like a replacement, which is how you got out at the time. And he kind of reconciles a little bit with his guardian. And John Allan is able to get him an appointment at the military academy at West Point instead. So in 1830, he starts there. He's 21 years old at this point. He does really well in his subjects at first. And like, there are the records of like how he was doing. He was particularly good at French. He also was doing really well in his math class. But he really was struggling because, obviously it's West Point, so there's really harsh discipline. Apparently the food is terrible, he says. And there are, I think there's a little bit of debate about what really happens, but he wants to leave and he either needs like more money from his adoptive father, from John Allan, to stay, or he needs to go, but he needs Allan's consent to leave and he won't give it. So he says, well, that's fine. I'll flunk out. Honestly, as any 21-year-old man would do. And he somehow, between July and December of 1831, gets himself 44 offenses and 106 demerits, which is frankly impressive. And, he obviously is doing really poorly in his classes, mostly because he never goes. He's continually drunk. This is sort of when we see his alcoholism start to take a toll. And he also apparently at one point shows up to formation naked, which gets him some sort of demerit. I assume it's where that's what happens there. I literally am like, what do they do to you at West Point if you roll up to formation naked? Would love to know. But yeah, so unsurprisingly, in January of 1832, he's court-martialed. He's expelled on 2 charges, the first of which is gross neglect of duty, and the second of which is disobedience of orders. I guess the answer to what happens if you show up to formation naked is you get court-martialed. But yeah, and this like one final move though, which is fascinating. So he had made himself kind of popular amongst the other guys there by writing a bunch of little poems and stuff making fun of their instructors. It's very like Amy March in that scene in the 2019 Little Women, from what I can tell, you'll be popular if you make fun of the teachers better than everyone else. So before he leaves, he convinces some of his classmates to give him $170, which, in that time period, that's quite a sum of money that he's collected. And he says he's going to publish these poems, right? So he does publish poems, but he doesn't publish these poems. He goes and he publishes his actual serious poetry, like inspired by John Keats, instead of the ones that he had shared with his classmates. And when the volume comes out and they're like super excited to get it because they helped fund it, they're all horrified. And supposedly a bunch of them like throw it in the Hudson River because they're so mad that this is not what they thought they were funding. They're like, we don't want this, fancy poetry. We wanted making fun of our teachers, which I just thought was delightful and honestly, like, in a way, like, doesn't fit with the rest of everything, but it does, because, like, I did not know Edgar Allan Poe, apparently the king of petty, but, like, not only is he gonna get himself kicked out because he doesn't want to be there,
He goes out in the blaze of glory.
one final move on his way out. Like,
so I just converted how much $170 in 1832 is. It is $6,000.
Right, and like that's from several of his classmates put together, but still,
that is like a significant chunk of change when you think about the fact that like later on he's being paid like $340 for a short story. Like he was like, and then I'm going to pocket some of this change to make up for my times here.
Feels to me like that's kind of the equivalent of like if some kid is getting kicked out of college and he convinces his like friends there to give him $6,000 and he's like, I'm gonna go make this short film that's essentially gonna be like Mega Piranha, right? Like it's gonna be some like dumb shit that's like their joke, right? And then he goes and just like makes his own like weird artsy short film, and they're like, what is this? Like
this is not what I've crowdfunded. He really started a GoFundMe. It was like, hi, I've been kicked out of West Point and I really want to make this film about my time. So can you send me some money?
Really? That's my two favorite theories that I didn't share earlier in how he died. One was actually genuinely that like he ran into some of his old classmates from West Point in Baltimore and they like beat him up badly enough that it like caused him brain damage.
I've always thought that he got jumped. I didn't know by who, because like he's muttering the name Reynolds.
Right, Reynolds. And so that's one theory. I think that the theory about like the cooping is like that's kind of what I lean towards. It's election day and he's found outside a polling place. Like
it doesn't take a detective. It doesn't take Gus to answer this one.
Right. Like Gus would be like, I think we know what happened here. The other theory is that like Elmira, who at that point is like Mrs. Shelton, I think, because she's widowed, but her brothers like found him and like beat him up because they didn't want him marrying her. But I mean, frankly, like
he was a hot mess. Like, yes, he was an amazingly talented writer, but he was drunk, he had gambling debts. He was kind of chaotic.
To be fair, at this, like, I would buy that a lot more if she wasn't like already a widow at this point. Like, if they were saying that like he was trying to marry some like young unmarried woman, and her brothers were like, "We're gonna F him up." I don't know what I can say on this podcast. It's literally my podcast. I'm like, am I allowed to cuss?
I was like, Nicole.
Our podcast, but you know what I mean. I don't know why I just suddenly got like really nervous about saying that. Okay. But so now I have to say it though. So like, then I would understand if it's like, oh, we think her brothers were like, we're going to fuck him up. It feels weird for the age that Elmira would have been at the time for her brothers to be like,
yeah, because
let's go all the way to
40.
Right. And for them to be like, we're going to follow him from Richmond to Baltimore. Like, just to beat him up. Like, why wouldn't they just beat him up somewhere around there? Like,
I also
feels like a lot of work.
It's definitely not zero in terms of the betting odds of how many people that he had gotten on his.
That's my thing. Yeah, I think there's more likely candidates.
Because like I know with the Reynolds thing, the tavern keep at the tavern that he was last seen as name was Reynolds, and the editor of a newspaper that he apparently had beef with was also named Reynolds. So like I'm just saying there's plenty of things.
I think that's like a solid theory. I think the whole theory around like, he had some sort of something medical going on. Honestly, like the rabies thing could be true.
Not in his own clothes, or am I?
Yeah, he was in like.
Okay.
So he was in like some like, which they say that also feels weird to me. Like, why? How do we know he's not in his own clothes?
All I can imagine was that he was in clothes that were too big for him because he was kind of a scrawny guy, and I guess that maybe you could be like, this looks like a grown man's suit, not a grown suit.
Which, and I think there's something that I was reading, I don't remember it right now, that like that also does sort of go with the whole cooping theory.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so I do think that like some form of somebody got a hold of him is probably right, or he had rabies.
He beat himself up.
Right. Well, either of which feels he beat a raccoon up and it went poorly.
It was the raven. The raven had gotten their friend, the raccoon.
Oh my god! And he took one bite and that's all it takes. But yeah, like it is this weird thing of this, like, he's literally on his way out from this place that, like, he could have done well for himself. Like, clearly, like, he was doing well until he suddenly was like, I'm over this. Which, it's funny, too, in that, like, he only ends up at West Point because he's like, I'm over being in the Army. I can't wait another 3 years to get out. And he's
I feel like that's kind of the story of his life.
Yeah.
That's the story of his life. Like, the number of times this man moves, and moving back then was not, like, easy. It wasn't like packing up the sedan and, like, moving to the next state.
You're calling U-Haul. Like,
no. I'm like, I, as an armchair psychiatrist, I think he had ADHD of some form as well, because this man is never settled. And also, like, I've just personally found as somebody who has ADHD, like, very creative people, and a lot of his, like, creativeness feels like it could be born out of some sort of neurodivergency. And he was also just a very odd duck.
Not, and like, again, not to like be like trying to diagnose him, but the fact that he wrote like poetry and short stories, I think also actually like kind of ties into that diagnosis that, like, could the man have turned out long form works? Like, I mean, he has a few, but it's not like what he was churning out. Like,
no. And poetry is like such a very specific style that you have to be a little bit crazy to like get all of it down. I say this as somebody who has a binder full of like ridiculous handwritten poetry that I wrote when I was younger. That's actually not that bad. Yeah, you have to be a little bit unhinged.
I do think it's important though, like whenever we talk about Poe, to not, and this like this might sound funny, like I'm not even the Poe fangirl that you are, but like to not loop him in with the sort of like Hemingway Fitzgerald drunk set.
No.
Because I think this is a very different, and like I'm also not trying to like talk down that I think that like, but they also had things going on for them.
Yeah.
Especially Hemingway coming from the war.
Poe
but
had a very
think, like,
different. Yeah.
Poe's version of alcoholism is never like, I'm out on the town with the boys. Like, he's not like, cracking up in a cold one with the boys.
I'm an orphan. Everybody hates me.
Except for my 13-year-old wife.
Except for my 13-year-old wife. And honestly, like, their relation, that's why one of the reasons why I was like, oh, I'm going to have Nicole do this part. Because like I have so many feelings about that just from like having read so much. I was like, this is actually so much safer if I don't talk about this, because like there's just so many factors that I always get really frustrated with modern audiences and modern readers trying to apply modern society onto historical society, when like there's so many factors that we will never know, because that family was not going to put it out there. Like, was she like compromised? Did something happen? Like, did they think that somebody's baby was on the way, like, and you step up and move in?
Was there some dude trying to
be creepy? They also like had no real man of the house, and like there's so many protection for like financials.
Yeah. And like the thing that gets me is that like there are cases where you see something like this and it is creepy and it is weird. But there's typically some sort of proof of that. Like, that sounds funny, but like he writes about her in a manner that does not,
and not like, and they never had children.
Yeah. Exactly.
Like, there's not even like lost children. There's no like miscarriages reported. Nothing of that. Like, it just seems like
the fact that he is still maybe reeling from this previous heartbreak. Like, there's a lot of reasons I'm willing to give this guy the benefit of the doubt in a way that I like normally would not give a man of this time.
Exactly. That's why I'm always like, let me come out swinging for Poe, because this is not the same. Like, it feels so different.
And just the way that he writes about women, I think, is quite different.
And the fact that he maintains like a lot of really strong female friendships, like you mentioned,
platonically,
platonically. Was it Annie? Annie.
Yeah, hold on. There's two women in particular who like help financially support him. Annie Richmond
and Annie.
Yeah. And Sarah Anna Lewis, So yeah, I think there's more to that than.
And it doesn't like most Poe scholars are like, yes, this is kind of weird, but like there's so many different factors. We can't just like paint a modern brush over this.
My thing too is that like he's a public figure in this time period. And I really do think that if something like truly strange was going on, like somebody would have pointed it out.
Oh,
like,
yeah. I mean, and
You know
plenty
what
of
I
people
mean?
did with other relationships. Like, let's not pretend that
Exactly.
didn't get called out. So yeah, I just
Right.
think I think it's
Yeah.
different. I always, every time I see somebody like realize that on Twitter, I dread
Oh my God.
the day that
Yeah.
I'll see of all the nonsense. 'Cause I'm like, oh, God, it wasn't
Let's cancel
2023.
Edgar Allan
I'm
Poe.
like, yes, let's
Like,
cancel this poor man.
oh my God. Like, his life canceled him already. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
life took its toll on him. But you know, one thing that was positive is the pretty costumes. I really pulled that one
That was a
deep.
really good transition.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you. I'm really proud of it.
Yeah.
Um, so the costumes of the Pale Blue Eye were designed by, I'm so sorry if I mispronounced her name. I tried to find an interview. There are not many where she says her name. Kasia Wallach Maimone, I believe. Probably mispronounced that. She has an incredibly diverse resume, including A Quiet Place and its sequel, Ready Player One, and most recently, The Gilded Age. She also worked on Moonrise Kingdom. Like, honestly, this is just a small sampling of her resume. And she also worked with Scott Cooper on Black Mass. So working with familiar creatives, love to see that. We see some consistency through projects. Unfortunately, she hasn't done like any interviews for this film's costuming, so I was not able to find any like really good quotes or comments about the production of this film, which is a real shame because honestly, the costumes in this film are phenomenal. And like, obviously, I've said this before and I'll say it again, military uniforms are so easy to costume, especially when they're like very specific costumes and you know what they look like, and they're honestly very boring to talk about. But there are some really big costume highlights for the very handful of women that are in this production, particularly with the Marquis family. They really stand out throughout this entire film. Their costuming is just so luscious and really deviates from the drab military and very masculine costumes that are throughout this film. And I was just transfixed with all of them, particularly with Julia and Leah. They just have so many stunning costumes. And I actually thought the last dress that Julia wears, the cream striped dress, reminded me so much of the Sleepy Hollow striped dress. I know the Julia stripes are much wider than the ones from Sleepy Hollow, but just very gothic horror vibes. And especially with that final act of the film that really, really leans into the gothic horror of it all. I loved it. And I just thought everything about those costuming choices were genius. There's a lot of really exquisite fabrics that are utilized throughout this film, most of which would have actually been really accessible for the period because a lot of fabrics were manufactured up north. And so even though this family wasn't necessarily like high class, like yes, they were a doctor's family, but not the like still the social standing that you would think they would have like huge elaborate dresses. It makes sense for some of the elaborate dresses that they have because you would have had the materials very easily accessible. And so that makes sense. Because at first I was like, well, this seems like maybe too many really nice brand new looking dresses. But when you think about means of production, it all makes sense in the end. I really loved all of these like really plush velvets, the chintz cottons, the ruffles, the dress that Leah's wearing when she faints in the cemetery is like just stunning. And it has like this perfect detailing with like this ruffle collar. It's just stunning. Like freeze frame as you watch this movie and really take in the costumes because it adds so many extra layers. And like I'm a texture person and I love when you feel like you can feel the fabrics that are on screen and just like just everything about the composition of this just worked so well for me. And I have to say, this is one of the few period films that have actually done period accurate hair and beautiful bonnet.
I was shook.
I was so shook. I was like, this is everything I want in every period drama I watch. And my mom had a really good theory about this was because this costume designer had just come off of The Gilded Age, was like in between seasons. And that show is so over the top that like you want to continue that. You want to continue that vibe, even though very different time periods, but still like the ornamentation of both of those periods aren't dissimilar. Lots of hats, lots of gloves, lots of fabrics. Like you want to carry that through. And it just makes me really happy because this is like honestly one of my biggest gripes with historical films is the fact that they let their hair, I'm going to mention Little Women. I know I harp on it all the time, but like the hair hanging down always bugged me, even though it makes sense for the Little Women because they are a little bit more free spirits, but you still see people in that town that have their hair down and they're not wearing bonnets when they would have been wearing bonnets. And I know a lot of people will say, oh, well, like bonnets cause shadows on faces when we have lights up. And I'm like, then work with your lighting team to avoid that. There's like ways to bounce the light off that will light up their face, but also not cause shadows from the bonnets. Also, a shadow from a bonnet is not the end of the world. Life has shadows. And so it just made me really happy to see them. And there's so many beautiful ones. Like I wish that this was a video. And so I could just show you like tons of pictures of the bonnets because I love hat making. I wish if I could go back in time, I would be a hat maker. I would be a bonnet maker. When I was like a teenager, I had a really short bout where I thought I was going to make fascinators. Like I love head stuff. It just makes me very happy. Yes. I don't think
I remember this. I remember
you should remember this.
Yeah, I remember it.
Yep. I still have all the materials. It was one of those ADHD spirals where I was like, I'm going to become a hat maker. And then I like bought the materials and never touched them again.
Classic.
Really love that. But it just made me happy.
I found all my cross-stitching stuff recently. It's fine.
I have that too. Yep, I have my sampler, my half-done sampler, really living.
I finished mine, not to impress you.
Okay, well, but, I'm impressed. Yeah. Now you're like marriageable. You could do cross-stitching.
You couldn't tell, but I...
Only now.
That's where I'm going wrong. I'm not showing all the men my sampler.
Your sampler. Oh God, if only Leah had shown Poe her sampler instead of the things that she showed him.
Listen, I don't think she needed to. I think he was on board. He
was so transfixed by her. I was like, oh, you poor silly boy.
I relate. That was me watching Fresh.
You're like, you are, what is it? Was it the angler fish that like dangles the pretty thing in front of the fish and then eats them? Like I'm yeah.
Yep.
That would have been me with all of these costumes. My mom found this really funny quote, though, from Edgar Allan Poe, which is like, there is no exquisite beauty without some strangeness in the proportion, which she was like, this fits the marquee people. Like my mom was like, this fits the marquee people so well because there's so much beauty and they're so strange. Like,
I love this movie. Oh, I'm literally talking about this movie. I kind of want to watch it again now.
I know. I'm like, oh, this made me love it even more to talk about it and Poe. And honestly, like, I feel like we need more Poe movies. So I need everybody to watch this. Not so we get this exact same casting in. I'm fine if we have a new cast, even though I think Melling is the perfect Poe. He is literally the embodiment of the man. But just because there's so much to be said in his storytelling and in his life. And I feel like it hasn't really been tapped into at all. Like, sure, all of his works come into play throughout all of this genre because it has become so embedded in our conscious.
We have so much inspired by it and not enough like actually adapted from it. Yeah. Yes, I will say, this is very much like just a quirky little representation of Poe, but there is a YouTube series called Edgar Allan Poe's Murder Mystery Dinner Party.
Yes.
I was going to say, have you seen it, right?
Yes.
It's very cute. It's by Shipwrecked Comedy. I actually think Sean Prasad makes an amazing Poe.
Yes.
He's got the like oddball down enough, but like still endearing. And it's like the general idea is like Poe has invited all of these famous writers to his murder mystery dinner party, but then an actual murders start occurring. So it's very cute. I've watched it like 6 times.
So basically Glass Onion.
It really is like Glass Onion. Like I literally, when I saw Glass Onion, I was like, this is just like Edgar Allan Poe's murder mystery dinner party, but without authors. Like I was like, I miss Jane Austen. Where is she? But yeah, highly recommend that. That and this are my 2 favorite representations of Poe.
Yes, until Netflix calls us to do the Detective Poe series.
Until we keep writing, until us and Netflix keep Harry Melling employed.
Exactly. Like we'll keep you booked and busy. Don't worry, baby.
Booked and busy, baby.
Also, they both just seem so humble. I did not talk about Christian Bale like at all this episode, which is like shocking for somebody who's watched his.
I
like,
wondered
entire
if you were just
filmography.
having to like hold yourself back. Like,
Honestly, I kind of was. Because I always try, I don't know. I love Christian Bale, but I've watched so many interviews of the two of these because they're paired together for this. And they are both so humble and so sweet. And it just makes my heart so happy.
you love to see it.
You love to see it.
I was just gonna say, I also do think like Christian Bale gives a really nice performance.
He gives a fantastic performance.
Like honestly, seeing him in this movie has made me like forgive him for what he did in
I was like, oh wow, isn't it great that this is the only movie that came out in 2022 for him?
Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the thing is like also like one of the things about watching this movie again reminded me of like how good Christian Bale is in period pieces, and like he does them occasionally. He does them more often than not, but not usually the period pieces I care about. And I think something that I really would like to see from his career would be for him to go back to doing things like period dramas, specifically period romances. Like everything about his aesthetic is so good, and like he will always be my Laurie. And that was such a peak Christian Bale moment. Yeah. And I think that he has reached a certain peak, not in his like career, but in the types of films that he's done, that I think that he should consider branching out and having fun. It doesn't always have to be serious. And I would just love to see this Christian Bale, this specific look on Christian Bale and like a period drama where it's romantic and he gets to be like the romantic lead, because he had everything about like the Byron, like the, oh my God, I'm going to say like the Byron-esque feel.
Yeah, but like
broody.
Byronic hero. Like,
there we go. Yeah. I was going to say bionic and I was like, no.
Yeah, that too.
But like this, like, oh, the weight of the world is on my shoulders and like life is so hard. Like, I like that.
Woe is
my man.
Me.
Woe and like, Poe is me.
I literally throughout some of the movie, I was like, okay, we get it. Like, you're sad.
But
then they revealed why. And I was like, oh, never mind. I was like, never mind. Like,
honestly, love that this man has done 2 sad dad roles in 1 year. Thank you for that, Christian Bale. You literally were like, hey, this is for Maggie. But I love this movie. And also, like, I have to say, like, I know a lot of people have complained about Melling's accent, but it's so freaking accurate for Richmond.
Yeah.
Like, specifically,
maybe I just want to see, like, maybe it's just that I only want to see, like, detectives with a weird accent.
Okay, yeah. I know somebody, I got mad at somebody who was like, oh, it's the Benoit Blancification. And I was like, no, some people have Southern accents. And like specifically Richmond at this period of time. So like there's areas outside of Richmond that still maintain a very Southern accent, which is funny because like Richmond's only a couple hours south from where I live. And I don't think I have a Southern accent unless I've watched some sort of Southern media. Like
unless I'm around people with accents.
Yeah. And then I absorb it. And then I'm fine.
Same.
But when I was working on a set in Richmond for like the majority of a year, and a lot of our local crew was from like Goochland, they did not sound like Melling.
Well, it's one of those areas that has a very contained accent, kind of like Wilmington has its own accent.
Yeah.
Like,
and I'm like, this actually sounds really accurate. And also, I just only want British actors doing Southern accents because their cadence is the exact same, so it doesn't come across sounding weird.
It is. I genuinely only Southerners and British people should be allowed to do Southern accents.
Exactly.
Like, I also think the thing is that I think that the accent works so well for the fact that, like, also Poe is meant to stick out in this setting. And, you know, he's giving, like, Melling's giving this very, like, theatrical performance. And I'm not saying it's like theater. I'm saying Poe is being theatrical. And I think that that's, you know, accurate.
Yeah.
It works with it.
It does. And most of his poetry actually sounds better in a Southern accent.
Yeah.
Like there's a TikToker, I can't remember what their username is. They pop up all the time that reads classic literature with his really beautiful Southern accent. That man has a gorgeous accent.
Yeah.
And like, there's just certain, like, Shakespeare sounds much better with a Southern accent.
And I think it is because it has a more similar cadence to the English accent that it's written in. Like, and I do think that the thing with Poe is that we don't often talk about him that much, I feel like, as a Southern writer, because, you know, he's from the upper South. Like, he's, you know,
like right at the Mason Dixon line.
He's not Faulkner, but like, I really do think that you see a lot of influence from him being raised in Richmond.
Yeah.
You know, he's born in Boston, but he leaves when he's 3. So like, what's he really know? Like, you know, he's not a Duncan girly.
No,
he wasn't there long enough.
And Baltimore has a very distinct accent as well, which isn't Southern, obviously. That's unless you talk to the Civil War. But
I was gonna say, in this time period, even Baltimore is more a part of the South. Like,
and honestly, the accent of, even though it sometimes sounds more like it could be getting into like the Boston, the way certain hard letters are, I think that Baltimore is not dissimilar from Southern sometimes, because it blurs into that sometimes hard to understand. Like Balmer doesn't sound Northern, that sounds Southern.
Yeah, exactly. It's
just
and also the other thing is too, like, you think like at this period in time, he's already spent a good amount of time going up and down the coast, and like he would have just been coming from South Carolina.
Yes.
At Fort Moultrie, which like is...
That's the one. That's where I went to, Fort Moultrie.
But I think like it makes sense that like whenever you're moving around that much in places that have strong accents, your accent's going to get a little funky.
Yeah. So
like I don't know. I will hear no criticism of Harry Melling in this film. We need to like talk amongst ourselves and decide if we think he's a co-lead or if he's supporting to Christian Bale, because I'm gonna have him in my ballots at the end of this year. Like,
oh yes,
that's why we have to decide that. Like,
co-lead.
I need to know where I'm putting him. Maybe I'll just put him in whichever category is more empty, and then I'll like argue to death that that's where he belongs.
Also, we just have to love that he has also spoken out about J.K. Rowling and has indeed said that trans women are women and trans men are men. So we love him for that.
Yep. We love him for that. Yeah. Like as is correct.
Exactly. Bare minimum, but still proud of him for
bare minimum, but we still love to see it, especially in a year where like several cast members have spoken out in support of her.
Yes.
Great finds. Get it together.
Truly.
Yeah.
She's not that wealthy anymore. You can ignore her.
I won't speak well of the dead, but I will speak ill of Ray Fiennes. But yeah. He's alive, so I can still pick on him.
Oh gosh.
I really said that, didn't I? But
you did.
Yeah, I think that's the sign that this episode is done.
It's just spiraled. I mean, this is the first episode of the year. We had to come in with some like hard swings. Come in with a bang.
We have a very exciting episode coming next.
Yes.
That I don't want to like give away, but it's very relevant to my interests. And then we've got some very exciting stuff coming up. But I did want to say, like, if you are listening and there is a film from this past year, like specifically anything 2022 that you want us to cover, let us know. And also if there's anything coming up in 2023 that you want us to cover, let us know. Obviously we'll be covering Emily, we'll be covering Chevalier, we'll be covering, you know.
That's the film we made happen.
That is the film that we manifested. So we will cover it. But there's some very exciting period films coming out this year. We just got the news that Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris is becoming a full series, and they've got the rights to the other 3 books. So there's lots of fun content coming. So make sure that you are, you know, following, and let us know if there's like something that you specifically want to make sure that we cover.
Absolutely.
But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us in our 46th. I had to check. I was like, what number are we on?
I cannot believe
episode of Petticoats and Poppies.
We would love to hear from you on social media and to hear what you think of The Pale Blue Eye.
Or just what you think of Harry Melling in general.
Honestly.
You can find us on social media at HGATM Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Definitely let us know there if you have requests. You can find Maggie over at Maggie of the Town on Twitter. And you can find me on Twitter at Nicole Ackman16.
You can listen to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, the Erglo Media website, and Audible. If you like what you hear, don't forget to leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts and on Podchaser, as well as on Spotify. Every few episodes, if you give us a good rating or review or leave us a good comment, we will read that so you can be featured.
To be honest, even if it's a bad comment,
even if it's a bad one, like, we'll still comment.
Like, we'll roast you back, but, you know. And we will be back soon, as I said, with another episode as we continue to look at period films from a history and film perspective.
You've been listening to Petticoats and Poppies,
History Girls at the Movie. And we will be back soon, as I said, with another episode as we continue to look at period films from a history and film perspective.
Indeed. Quoteth the Raven, nevermore. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping as of something gently rapping on my chamber door. 'Tis a visitor and nothing more.
I don't know why I decided to treat that like it was a concert.
Nicole was at a rave.
I was raving to that Edgar Allan Poe.
You were raving to it?
Stop. I'm leaving. Goodbye.